They say the truth will set you free, but they never tell you what happens when the truth has been buried for 50 years under a foundation of lies, concrete, and the best real estate in California. My story is about digging it up. It starts with a single image sent to my phone, a weapon disguised as a miracle. If you've ever felt trapped, silenced, or underestimated, then you know this isn't just my story. It's ours. Stick with me, and we'll unearth it together. Make sure to follow, like, and share this with anyone who needs to hear it. And hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss a single moment of the demolition. The message arrived without a name, a ghost on my phone's screen. For a moment, it was just an anonymous gray bubble in a sea of notifications about weather and news headlines I no longer read. Then the image loaded. It was stark black and white, a grainy galaxy swirling around a tiny, bean-shaped star. A sonogram. My breath caught, a familiar cold knot tightening in my stomach, the same one I'd felt 1,000 times when my husband Richard would enter a room. It was the feeling of an ambush. Before I could process the image, before I could even form a question, a second message buzzed, this one with a name attached, Ashley. Thought you should see your grandchild, Nora. We'll need a nursery soon. The ocean view room would be perfect. It wasn't signed with love. There were no hearts, no exclamation points. It was a statement of intent, a real estate claim. Ashley. My son David's girlfriend, a woman with teeth as white as the sea foam and eyes that appraised everything, and everyone, for its resale value. She wasn't just announcing a pregnancy, she was serving an eviction notice disguised as a family update. This house, my house, perched on the cliffs of Carmel by the sea, had been my home for 50 years. 50 years of being its keeper, and in many ways, its prisoner. This text message wasn't an olive branch. It was the latest salvo in their carefully orchestrated war of attrition. A campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed me of my confidence, to make me feel old, incompetent, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. It was the next logical step after the concerned calls about the stairs, the glossy brochures for luxury senior living left on the kitchen island, the way David would sigh heavily whenever I couldn't immediately work the new smart TV he'd insisted on installing. They wanted me to believe I was a burden. They needed me to believe it, so that I would finally, gratefully, sign the papers and walk away from the only thing I had left that was truly mine. They saw me as a relic, a fragile artifact to be moved into a climate-controlled storage unit. As breakable as the collection of porcelain dolls my late husband Richard used to display in the grand entryway, their painted smiles frozen in a state of perpetual, silent compliance. And he had loved them. He said they represented timeless beauty. I knew they represented a beauty that couldn't talk back. David and Ashley thought they were chipping away at that same porcelain fragility. They thought that with enough pressure, I would simply crack. But as I stood there, phone in hand, looking out the panoramic window past my perfectly manicured roses, my gaze settled on the salt-weathered wood of the old garden shed at the edge of the property. It stood hunched against the wind, its paint peeling, its lock rusted shut for nearly a decade, and in that moment, I felt no anger. The usual surge of grief and frustration was absent. In its place was something else entirely, something cold, quiet, and terrifyingly clear. It was the soundless, satisfying click of a heavy lock disengaging deep within my soul. The tumblers, rusted shut by decades of silence and accommodation, had finally, irrevocably, turned. The time for being a porcelain doll was over. This house holds more ghosts than the Pacific has waves, and every single one of them answers to Richard. To the town of Carmel, he was a titan, a founding father of the modern era. The charismatic developer whose name was etched onto bronze plaques and chiseled into the cornerstones of the most prestigious buildings. He didn't just build structures, he built a legacy. He was respected, admired, even loved. To me, he was the architect of my gilded cage. His love wasn't a comfort. It was a form of beautiful, meticulous control. I remember one evening years ago, we were hosting a fundraiser for the local arts council. I had spent all afternoon rearranging the living room, even hanging a new painting I'd bought, a vibrant abstract that felt like a splash of defiance in a house of muted, respectable earth tones. Richard came in, circling the room with a glass of scotch in his hand, his eyes scanning everything. He stopped in front of my painting. He didn't say he hated it. He never would have been so crude. He simply reached out, his long, elegant fingers brushing against mine as he took my hand. "A masterpiece must be perfectly centered, my dear," he'd murmured, his voice a silken thread of condescension that only I could hear. He moved the painting a fraction of an inch to the left, his hand lingering on the frame, a gesture of ownership. In that moment, in a room full of people, he had made me invisible. His abuse was never in bruises or raised voices. It was in the slow, methodical erosion of myself, a death by 1,000 perfectly centered paintings. He worshipped legacy, status, the appearance of perfection. And this house, with its commanding view of the ocean and its impeccable design, was his temple. He chose every fixture, every color, every piece of furniture. It wasn't our home. It was his showroom. And my son, David, was his most devoted acolyte. I see Richard in him every day. It's in the way David's eyes sweep over the living room when he visits, not seeing the place where he took his first steps or the fireplace where we hung his Christmas stockings, but calculating square footage and potential market value. He sees it not as a home, but as an asset, an underperforming asset. His phone calls have become a masterclass in feigned concern. They always start the same way. "Just checking in, Mom. How are you feeling? Are you eating properly?" The questions are a preamble, a throat clearing before the real performance begins. "You know, Mom, the market in Carmel is just unbelievable right now. We could get a staggering price for the house. Think of what you could do with that. No more stairs to worry about, no more upkeep. There are some lovely managed care facilities down in Monterey. They have pools, social activities. It would be so much easier for you." He speaks of my life as if it's an inconvenience to be managed, a logistical problem to be solved with a real estate transaction and a deposit on a one-bedroom apartment with a walk-in shower. He's so desperate to step into his father's shoes, to become the magnate he believes Richard was. Just last week he called, his voice buzzing with an artificial excitement. "Mom, I have this incredible opportunity. A new development project, high-end condos overlooking the bay. It's a sure thing. But the buy-in is significant. Selling the house now. It would be the perfect way to fund it. It's exactly what Dad would have wanted. Using his legacy to build a new one." He said it with such reverence, such absolute certainty. He was honoring his father. But he doesn't understand. He can't. He inherited all of his father's ambition, but none of his cunning. He is a blunt instrument where Richard was a scalpel. He worships a monument, completely unaware that the foundations of this house, like the foundations of his father's precious legacy, are built on something far more unstable than sand. They are built on secrets and rot, and the first tremor is about to hit. In the quiet, suffocating perfection of my house, Eleanor's presence is the only thing that feels like a window being thrown open. Letting in the clean, salt-scrubbed air, she is the only person who walks through my front door and sees me, not just the real estate she is standing on. A retired lawyer with eyes that miss nothing and a laugh that has always been a little too loud for Carmel's polite society. She's been my friend since before Richard started paving over the town's charm with his ambition. She remembers the Nora I was before I became Mrs. Richard Sterling. This afternoon, as we sat in the sunroom with cups of chamomile tea, the silence between us was comfortable, a stark contrast to the charged quiet that usually filled these walls. I let the warmth of the mug seep into my hands, gathering my courage. I had to do this carefully. I had to make it sound like a game, a curiosity. "Ellie," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I traced the floral pattern on my teacup, avoiding her sharp gaze. "Just hypothetically, of course." She took a sip of her tea, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I love your hypotheticals, Nora. They're always more interesting than the local gossip. What is it this time?" "I was watching one of those true crime series on Netflix the other night," I lied, the fabrication feeling surprisingly easy on my tongue. It got me thinking about the legal side of things. For instance, what would be the statute of limitations on, say, major insurance fraud? From a long time ago. Her gaze narrowed slightly, the amusement fading into professional curiosity. "Well, that depends, Nora. On the specifics. For most fraud cases in California, it's 3 years from the date of the fraud, or from the date it was discovered. But for something major, something involving, say, a federal insurer or spanning multiple states, it can be much longer. Why? Is your new crime novel getting technical? I offered a weak, fluttering smile. Something like that. It's for my protagonist. She's in a bit of a jam. I took a breath and pushed forward. And what about construction negligence? If a developer hypothetically used substandard materials in a large project decades ago, knowing they were unsafe, but it was never discovered, could they still be held liable, even if they're no longer around? The developer himself? No, you can't sue a dead man, she said, her tone becoming more measured. But his estate? His company? Absolutely. If it could be proven that he knowingly and willfully endangered people, and that his negligence led to damages, the discovery rule would apply. The clock wouldn't start ticking until the defect was found. It could open a massive civil liability case, potentially criminal depending on the severity. She was watching me closely now, her lawyer's mind piecing together fragments I hadn't even offered. The air in the sunroom suddenly felt thicker. I set my cup down on its saucer with a soft clink. One more thing for my story, I said, the word feeling flimsy and transparent. What about irrevocable trusts? Can they truly be made ironclad, so that a specific beneficiary could be completely and permanently removed? No chance of a successful challenge? Eleanor didn't answer right away. She placed her own cup down, her expression shifting from curiosity to a deep, sober concern. She didn't press me for the details of my novel. She knew me better than that. She had been on the periphery for years, watching the high, polished walls Richard had built around me. She knew they weren't just made of wood and glass. Nora, she said, her voice soft but firm, an irrevocable trust, if properly drafted by a skilled attorney, is about as close to ironclad as you can get in the legal world. It's designed to be permanent, to withstand challenges. Disinheriting a direct heir like a child is a serious step. It invites a fight, but it can be done. She leaned forward, her eyes holding mine. I don't know what kind of story you're writing, Nora, but you sound like you need more than a hypothetical friend. You sound like you need a specialist. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a pen. She scribbled on a clean page, tore it out, and folded the paper in half. She slid it across the glass table to me. I didn't reach for it immediately. I just stared at the small white square. There's a firm in San Francisco, she said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. Chen, Albright, and Spector. They are absolute pit bulls, ferociously expensive, but they are the most discreet and the most lethal litigators on the West Coast. They specialize in complex estate disputes and corporate malfeasance. They eat people like your hypothetical developer for breakfast. I finally picked up the piece of paper. The name, Mr. Chen, and a phone number were written in Eleanor's sharp, precise script. The paper felt heavier than a brick in my hand. It wasn't just a phone number. It was a key. It was a weapon. It was the first stone I would have to lay for a new foundation, one built on the rubble of the old. As Eleanor gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door and put a hand on my arm. Her touch was warm, real. Whatever you're planning, Nora, she said, her eyes full of an understanding I hadn't realized I was so desperate for. Be careful. But don't you dare back down. The click of the front door closing behind her was the starting gun. The race had begun. The brass key felt like a small, cold bone in my palm. It had been years since I'd last held it, years since I'd had any reason to visit the garden shed. Richard had always called it his workshop, but he never built anything in there. He curated. The lock was rusted, clinging to its purpose with a stubborn grit that reminded me of my husband. I had to put my shoulder into the door, forcing it open with a groan of warped wood and a shower of dust and dead leaves. The air that hit me wasn't the familiar scent of potting soil and lawn fertilizer. It was the smell of sealed paper, of dry rot, of time itself turning to dust. It was the smell of secrets. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, a single bar of afternoon light cutting through a grimy window pane. There were no rakes, no shovels, no tools of a gardener's trade. The space was filled, wall to wall, with gray banker's boxes stacked 4 and 5 high. Each was labeled in Richard's sharp, meticulous script. Project Sparrow, Laguna Seca Contracts, Carmel Highlands 95. My gaze settled on a stack in the far corner, almost hidden behind a rotted canvas tarp. The label was stark, Annex 98. My breath hitched. The City Hall Annex, Richard's crowning achievement, the project that had made him a local legend, the project that followed the fire. I dragged the box into the single beam of light, the cardboard gritty under my fingers. My hands were trembling, not with age, but with a terrifying sense of purpose. I didn't need a knife. The tape was brittle. I pried open the lid. The first thing I saw wasn't a ledger, but a set of rolled blueprints. The paper yellowed at the edges. I spread them out on the dusty floor. It was the annex, the structural plans. And then I saw them, the notes. Tiny, penciled-in annotations in Richard's familiar hand, tucked away in the margins like guilty whispers. Subspec rebar here. A small arrow pointed to a foundational support column. Omit seismic brace number 4, inspector cleared. Bill for grade A copper, install grade C. My stomach turned. This wasn't just cutting corners. This was a blueprint for a catastrophe, a map of cynical, life-threatening greed. I dug deeper into the box. Under the blueprints were thick binders, invoices, hundreds of them. Pages and pages detailing deliveries of high-grade steel, premium lumber, specialized wiring, all from a supplier I'd never heard of. I flipped to another binder. Canceled checks, payouts. A neatly organized log of payments to city inspectors, listed not by name, but by a simple damning code. I-1, I-2. Each payment corresponded to a date of a past inspection on the Annex project. The whole edifice of my husband's reputation, the very foundation of our family's wealth, was a fraud. And at the very bottom of the box, sealed in a large manila envelope, was a thin file. My fingers felt numb as I pulled out the contents. A police report, dated November 12, 1998. The words accidental fire were underlined. It described a blaze at the Annex construction site, a small electrical fire that had gotten out of control, and then a single-page coroner's report. Victim, Marcus Thorne, age 52. Cause of death, smoke inhalation. The night watchman, I remembered his name from the papers. A widower with a young son. A tragic accident, everyone had said. A terrible shame. Tucked behind the report was the insurance claim. A detailed, multi-million-dollar claim filed by Sterling Development, citing catastrophic losses from the fire. A claim that had been paid in full within 60 days. I sat on the dusty floor of that shed. The documents spread around me like the wreckage of my life. The single beam of light felt like an interrogator's lamp. For 30 years, I had lived in this house, in this life he built, and I had chosen not to see. I had accepted his dismissiveness, his quiet corrections, his gaslighting, as the price of admission to a comfortable life. I'd allowed his control to feel like protection. I had been a willing accomplice through my silence, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't even name. Fear of being alone, fear of being poor, fear of what people would say. But looking at Marcus Thorne's name, seeing the cold calculus of my husband's crimes laid bare, that fear began to curdle. It burned in my throat, hot and acidic, dissolving 3 decades of passivity. It was changing, transmuting into something else, something cold and hard and clear, a purpose. I was no longer just Nora Sterling, the grieving widow in the big house on the cliff. I was the curator of my husband's sins. I was the keeper of his ledger, and the debt was long past due. The memory came unbidden, sharp and clear as the Carmel sky on a winter morning. It was years ago, when David was 16, all lanky limbs and a faint, hopeful dusting of a mustache on his upper lip. Richard had taken him to a construction site, one of his condo projects down the coast. I'd come along, for appearances. Richard stood with his arm draped around David's shoulders, a king showing his prince the scope of his kingdom. The air smelled of wet concrete and sawdust. "See, son?" Richard had said, his voice a low, confidential rumble. He pointed with his chin toward a crew pouring a foundation. They say it's all about what you build. But that's the public story. The real story, the one that matters, is about what you save. I watched David's face. I saw a flicker of confusion, a boy's innate sense of fairness trying to square his father's words with what he'd been taught in school. "But isn't that cutting corners, Dad?" he asked, his voice still holding its youthful treble. Richard squeezed his shoulder, a gesture that looked like affection, but was really an act of molding. "It's not cutting corners, David. It's smart business. It's our legacy. The architect puts in a spec for the most expensive material. The engineer over-designs for a 1 in a million event. They're covering themselves. We're the ones taking the real risk. We shave a little here, a little there. We use a cheaper grade of concrete that's 99% as good. We use plumbing fixtures that look the part but cost half as much. Nobody knows. Nobody gets hurt. And the difference, that goes to us. That's how we provide. That's how we stay on top of the cliff instead of being at the bottom, looking up." He had looked at me then, a quick, dismissive glance that said, "You wouldn't understand." He snuffed out that flicker of doubt in our son's eyes with a chain of corrupt pragmatism, binding David to him forever. That boy was gone, utterly and completely. The man who came to my house the day after I found the boxes in the shed was a hollow echo of his father, but without the charm or the subtlety. He didn't even bother to sit down. He paced my Persian rug, the one my own mother had given me, his expensive shoes scuffing the pattern. His phone was a constant presence in his hand, buzzing and vibrating with alerts from a world I didn't belong to. "Mom, you're not listening," he said, his voice tight with an impatience he barely tried to conceal. "I just came from a meeting with my investors. The projections for 2025 are insane. The market is at its absolute peak. It's a sign. We have to move now." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes sweeping the room, not seeing the memories, just the square footage. "Think about it. We sell this place now, at the top of the market. The capital. My God, Mom. We could fund my entire new coastal development project without even needing a bridge loan. We could finally build something truly ours." Ours. The word hung in the air, obscene. I looked at him, at his tailored shirt and his $2,000 watch, and all I could see was the ghost of Richard, whispering in his ear. He was worshipping a false idol, building his ambitions on a foundation of lies he didn't even know existed. "It's what Dad would have wanted," he said, delivering the line as if it were scripture. "He always said this house was our greatest asset. He built it to secure our future, using it to build my future. It's the ultimate tribute to him. To his legacy." The cold purpose that had settled in my bones in the shed solidified into ice. My silence was no longer passive. It was strategic. I let him talk, let him lay out his entire greedy, pathetic vision. He spoke of his father's wishes, of his business acumen, of the sterling name. He had no idea that I had spent the previous night reading the true story of that name, written in pencil in the margins of a blueprint. He wanted to build his legacy on the same rotten ground his father had consecrated, and he wanted me to hand him the shovel. I just looked at him, my expression placid, a mask I had perfected over 30 years. "I'll think about it, David," I said, my voice quiet. He heard concession. He heard a victory. He had no idea he was hearing a declaration of war. The sheer volume of paper was overwhelming. The ledgers, the invoices, the blueprints. It was a physical weight, the accumulated mass of Richard's deceptions. I couldn't do this alone. I needed a different kind of expert, someone from a world Richard had never understood and had always disdained. I needed my grandniece Maya. Maya was my sister's granddaughter, a student at Berkeley, currently home for the summer. She was a breath of fresh, clean air in the stale, heavy atmosphere of my house. She was sharp and funny and kind, with a casual mastery of the digital world that felt like a form of sorcery to me. When I called and asked if she could help me organize some old family documents, she agreed without a moment's hesitation. She arrived the next day with a sleek, modern scanner and a laptop covered in stickers for bands I'd never heard of. "Okay, Aunt Nora," she said, her eyes bright with energy. "What's the mission?" I led her not to the shed but to my study, where I had brought in two of the most damning boxes. I want to create a digital archive, I said, the lie tasting only slightly bitter. For safekeeping. She didn't question it. For the next week, my house, a place of oppressive silence, was filled with the quiet hum of the scanner and the gentle click of Maya's keyboard. She was an endlessly patient teacher. She showed me how to feed the documents, how to check the quality of the scans, how to name and organize the files in a logical system. Then came the part that mattered most. She walked me through setting up an encrypted cloud storage account. "This is like a digital vault, Aunt Nora," she explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Swiss-based servers, multi-layer encryption. Not even the company that owns it can see what's inside without your specific keys." Then she taught me how to create an anonymous email account, routing it through so many proxy servers that its origin would be virtually untraceable. She found my caution amusing. "Aunt Nora, are you becoming an international spy?" she joked one afternoon as I triple-checked the security settings. I managed a thin smile. "Just learning a new language, dear. It seems like a useful one to know these days." Her presence was a balm. She saw me, not as a fragile old woman, a relic to be managed, but as a person still capable of learning, of acting. She saw the tension that filled the house whenever David's name came up. He called several times that week, his tone a patronizing blend of impatience and feigned concern. "How are you, Mom? Have you called the realtor I recommended? You can't just sit on this. The market won't wait." One afternoon, after a particularly grating call, Maya looked up from her laptop, her brow furrowed. "He's a real piece of work, isn't he?" she muttered, more to herself than to me. "He talks to you like you're a child." I just nodded, a wave of gratitude washing over me. She saw it. Someone else finally saw it. She didn't know the half of it, not even a fraction, but her simple validation was like a brace on a fractured bone. She became my anchor in the storm I was meticulously planning. This quiet, brilliant, loving girl was an unwitting accomplice in the demolition of her own family's history. As she helped me upload the last of the files from the Annex 98 box, the police report, the payout logs, Richard's notes, I felt a sharp pang in my chest. It was a mixture of profound love for her and a cold, terrifying fear. I was using her goodness, her light, to bring a darkness into the world. The digital ghost of Richard's crimes was now fully formed, an immortal specter of data, stored safely in the cold, neutral ether of a server thousands of miles away, ready to be summoned with a single click. Maya stretched and smiled. "All done. Your family history is now officially preserved for all time." I looked at the screen, at the neat rows of files, and I knew she was right. It was preserved, and it was about to be put to use. The final piece of my own architecture had to be laid in a place far from Richard's influence. I drove myself to San Francisco, the coastal fog of Carmel giving way to the hard, clear light reflecting off the steel and glass towers of the city. The lawyer's office was on the 34th floor of one of them, a world of silent, air-conditioned efficiency that overlooked the gray, churning waters of the bay. Mr. Chen was younger than I'd expected, with watchful, perceptive eyes that missed nothing. He didn't offer platitudes or small talk. He listened, his hands steepled on a vast, empty desk, as I laid out my request. I didn't tell him about the shed, about the fire, about Marcus Thorne. I told him only what he, as a legal instrument, needed to know. "I wish to amend my living trust," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "I want to completely and irrevocably disinherit my only son, David Sterling." Mr. Chen didn't blink. He simply made a note on a legal pad. "Completely and irrevocably," he repeated, his tone flat. "You understand this will be challenged, Mrs. Sterling. Your son will almost certainly sue the estate upon your death. He will claim undue influence, or more likely, diminished capacity on your part. It will be a protracted and unpleasant battle." "I am prepared for that," I said. "In fact, I'm counting on it." We spent the next 3 hours structuring the fortress. We didn't just amend the old trust, we dissolved it and created a new one, airtight and unassailable. My house, my investments, every last dollar tied to the Sterling name would be placed into this new trust. Upon my death, The entire estate was to be liquidated. Every painting, every share of stock, every brick of the house on the cliff. "And the beneficiary?" Mr. Chen asked, his pen poised. This was the moment, the cornerstone of my entire plan. It wasn't about punishing David with poverty. It was about restitution. It was about creating something new from the rubble. "The entire proceeds," I said, my voice clear and steady, "will be used to fund a new charitable foundation. It will be called the Marcus Thorne Project." For the first time, a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, crossed Mr. Chen's professional mask. And its purpose? To provide pro bono legal aid and investigative resources for victims of corporate and construction fraud. He wrote it down without comment. It was the only amends I could offer to the ghost of a man I never knew, the only way to launder the dirty money my family was built on. The final document we drafted was thick, dense with legal protections and clauses designed to withstand any assault. But the weapon I planned to use first was brutally simple. At my instruction, Mr. Chen's assistant typed up a separate single-page document, a notarized notice of disinheritance. It contained no explanations, no apologies. It was a clean, legal dagger aimed directly at the heart of their ambition. As I rose to leave, the document secure in my handbag, Mr. Chen stood as well. He walked me to the door, his expression unreadable. "You understand, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "that this action will sever your family. There is no coming back from this. You are burning the bridge, the boat, and salting the earth behind you." I paused at the door and looked out the vast window at the cold, gray water of the bay, at the distant, immovable rock of Alcatraz. The structures men built to contain, to punish, to last forever. Richard had thought his legacy was a fortress. He was wrong. "I know," I said, turning back to face the lawyer. "Some structures are too rotten to be saved. They aren't worth renovating. They have to be demolished." I chose the envelope with care. Not the flimsy kind you use for bills, but a thick, cream-colored business envelope, the kind that feels heavy and important in your hands even when empty. Mine was not empty. It contained the architecture of my new life and the demolition order for my old one. I addressed it not to my son, not to Mr. and Mrs. David Sterling, to be, but in a firm, clear script to Ms. Ashley Vance. A small but significant detail. This was a business transaction. I didn't send it to the apartment they shared, a sterile glass box that always smelled faintly of air freshener and simmering resentment. No, that was their private space, their nest. My target was her public facade, the meticulously constructed persona she presented to the world. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to her place of work.
Carmel Coast Properties, the letterhead read, a brokerage so prestigious it was practically a local institution, its windows overlooking the main drag filled with glossy photos of nine-figure oceanfront estates, a place built on the bedrock of appearances. Driving to the post office, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fog was rolling in, muffling the cypress trees and softening the edges of the multi-million-dollar homes that lined the road. For 40 years, I had driven these streets feeling like a ghost, a silent passenger in a life designed by Richard. Today, I was the driver. I was the architect. I held the blueprints. I could picture the scene at her office with a clarity that was almost cinematic. The uniformed mail carrier arrives around 10:30, just as the morning buzz is peaking. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect teeth and a professionally friendly voice, signs for the stiff envelope. She scans the addressee. "Ashley, certified for you at the front desk," she calls out, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous open-plan office with its white oak floors and panoramic ocean views. Ashley would look up from her sleek, minimalist desk, probably in the middle of a call, charming a client from Atherton or Palo Alto. A flicker of annoyance, perhaps. Who would send certified mail to the office? It was so official, so disruptive. She'd stride to the front, her heels clicking with authority. She'd sign her name with a flourish, maybe even a hint of triumph, assuming it was a closing document or a bonus check she'd been expecting. She'd thank the receptionist with a tight smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and walk back to her desk,
the envelope held casually in her perfectly manicured hand. Her colleagues, sharks in their own right, would pretend not to watch, but they'd see everything. The weight of the paper, the formality of the address. Curiosity would be a low hum in the air. She'd sit, perhaps taking a sip of her green tea, and slide a silver letter opener under the seal, a crisp tear. She'd pull out the documents, prepared by Mr. Chen's meticulous staff, and then she would see it, the header, stark and brutal in its legalese. Notice of disinheritance. Her face, I imagined, would go through a rapid, silent series of transformations. First, confusion, a furrow of the brow, a rereading of the first line. Then, dawning comprehension, a sharp intake of breath. The blood would drain from her face, leaving her expensive foundation looking like a clay mask. The carefully constructed poise would shatter, not with a bang, but with a silent, internal implosion. She would look up, her eyes wide, and meet the curious, predatory gazes of her coworkers. In that moment, her value in that room, her currency, would plummet. They wouldn't know the details, but they would smell the blood in the water. They would see the desperate social climber who had just lost her footing on the ladder. I knew Ashley. I had watched her for 2 years. Her ambition wasn't just a desire. It was a ravenous, all-consuming fire. Her public image, her reputation for being on the inside track, was the very fuel that kept it burning. David wasn't the prize. He was just the ticket. This house, the sterling legacy, was the destination. Sending the papers to her first, and at her job, wasn't an act of petty revenge. It was a strategic strike. A demolition ball aimed directly at the weakest point in their alliance, her boundless, brittle, desperate greed. I paid for the postage in cash, slid the envelope across the counter, and walked out into the cool, gray air, feeling the first, clean sensation of a foundation being cleared. The silence in the house was different now. For decades it had been a heavy, oppressive silence, filled with the unspoken things, with Richard's disapproval and my fear. Now it was a charged, expectant silence, the quiet before a storm. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room, looking out at the Pacific as it churned under a pewter sky. I didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour after the post office had likely made its delivery, my phone rang, its shrill cry tearing through the quiet. The caller ID flashed. David. I let it ring 3 times, a small ritual of control. Then I answered, my voice even. Hello? It wasn't David. It was a shriek, a raw, ragged, ugly sound that had been stripped of every last layer of Ashley's practiced, honey-sweet charm. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap. You vindictive old witch. What is this? What have you done? I said nothing. I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting her fury break against me like waves on the rocks below. I could hear her ragged, panting breaths, the sound of a complete and total unraveling. It was a symphony of desperation.
Do you have any idea what you've done to me? In front of everyone. My boss saw. They all saw. You senile, evil hag. You're trying to ruin me.
I remained silent. There was nothing to say. Her hysteria was the proof that my strategy had been flawless. It had hit its mark with devastating precision. Then I heard a muffled scuffle and the sound of the phone being snatched away. David's voice came on the line, choked with a mixture of disbelief and secondhand rage. Mom, what the hell is this? Ashley she's hysterical. I can't even get her to make sense. This is a joke, right? Some kind of sick, twisted joke? His voice was high, frantic. He was trying to reassert the old order, the one where he was the rational adult and I was the fragile, aging mother who needed managing. No, David, I said, my voice as calm and flat as a winter sea. It is not a joke. There was a beat of stunned silence. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head as he struggled to process this new reality, this new mother he didn't recognize. The disbelief curdled into anger. The son who had been taught by his father that everything had a price, that every person could be managed, was losing control. What do you mean it's not a joke? He sputtered. You can't do this.
That's my inheritance. That's my future. The project. Dad's legacy. Everything depends on this house. Richard's legacy, I said, the words tasting like ash, is not what you think it is. His tone shifted again, this time to the familiar cadence of bullying he'd learned at his father's knee. I'm your son, your only son. What is wrong with you? Has someone been talking to you? Is it that lawyer friend of yours, Eleanor? Has she been putting ideas in your head? When I didn't answer, the bullying dissolved into a desperate, pleading whine. Mom, please, we can talk about this. Just undo it. Call the lawyer.
Tell them you made a mistake. We can work this out. Ashley is just... She's ambitious. She gets carried away. But we love you. The lie was so bald, so pathetic, it was almost pitiable. He didn't love me. He loved what I represented. An asset to be liquidated. Then came the final, inevitable turn. The threat. His voice dropped, becoming hard and ugly. You know, Mom, you're not well. You haven't been for a while. You're forgetful. You're paranoid. I'll have you declared incompetent. I swear to God, I will. I'll get power of attorney. I'll take control of your assets for your own good. You won't get away with this. This house will be mine. The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. For a single, fleeting moment, the old fear flickered inside me. The fear of being powerless, of being locked away, of having my own mind used as a weapon against me. It was the ghost of Richard speaking through his son's mouth, but it was just a ghost, an echo.
A dying ember in a cold hearth. I had faced the architect of that prison for 40 years. His pale imitation didn't stand a chance. I let him finish his tirade. I listened to the threats, the justifications, the frantic, desperate scramble of a man watching his future crumble. When there was nothing left but his own ragged, angry breathing on the line, I spoke. My voice was no longer flat. It was colder than the ocean spray against the windows, as hard and unyielding as the granite cliffs. The house is not for sale, David, I said, each word a carefully placed stone in a new wall. And neither am I. I ended the call. I didn't slam the phone down. I pressed the end button with a steady finger and placed the handset back in its cradle. The house was silent again. But this time, it was the silence of victory. It took them 4 days. 4 days of charged silence on their end. 4 days of methodical preparation on mine. The courier arrived on a Tuesday morning, his white van a jarringly bright presence on my quiet, fog-shrouded street. He handed me a thick legal envelope, his expression impassive. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. The names on the front told the whole story. David Sterling and Ashley Vance 5. Nora Sterling. I took the documents into the kitchen and spread them out on the old oak table, the same table where I had once helped David with his homework. The legalese was dense and aggressive, a weaponized form of fiction. They were petitioning for an emergency conservatorship. They wanted the court to declare me mentally incompetent and appoint David as the guardian of my person and my estate. Their lawyer was a man from Monterey I'd read about, a notorious shark named Peterson who specialized in elder abuse cases, usually, ironically, defending the victims, not orchestrating the abuse. David must have paid him a handsome retainer. My money, most likely. The complaint was a masterpiece of twisted narrative. It painted a portrait of me as a senile, paranoid widow, a frail old woman being manipulated by unknown, malicious parties for their own financial gain. Every action I had taken to protect myself was repurposed as evidence of my decline. My large cash withdrawal to pay Mr. Chen's firm was cited as proof of financial recklessness and susceptibility to influence. My reconnection with my grandniece Maya was twisted into erratic social behavior and association with untrustworthy individuals. They even mentioned my hypothetical conversation with Eleanor, framing it as evidence of a growing obsession with conspiracy theories. It was a legal masterstroke, designed to do one thing: strip me of my autonomy, my credibility, and my home in a single, brutal motion. They were trying to take my voice, my sanity, and my story away from me. The next blow came that afternoon. A phone call from Eleanor. Her voice was strained, the usual warm timbre replaced with a tight professional tone. Nora, I've been served.
she said without preamble. A subpoena. They want me to testify at the hearing about our conversation, about the hypothetical questions. Eleanor, I am so sorry, I began, a wave of guilt washing over me. I had dragged my friend into my war. Don't be, she cut me off, her voice firming up. It's a classic move, Nora. A transparent attempt to intimidate and isolate you. They want to sever your support system, make it look like even your oldest friend thinks you've lost your mind. They want me to be the one to put the nail in your coffin. It won't work. She paused. But you need to be prepared. Peterson is vicious. They're not just coming for the house anymore. They're coming for you. Her words were a cold confirmation of what I already knew. The whispers started the next day.
At the grocery store, a woman I'd served on charity committees with for 20 years, Margaret, saw me in the produce aisle and abruptly turned her cart around, her face a mask of awkward pity. The man at the butcher counter, who had been calling me Mrs. Sterling for 3 decades, suddenly couldn't meet my eye. I walked past the cafe where I sometimes had coffee, and I could see heads turning, conversations dropping to a murmur. I was alone, a pariah in my own town. The community Richard had so carefully cultivated, the network of favors and influence he had built, was now being wielded against me by his own son. They were building a cage around me, bar by legal and social bar. The walls were closing in, just as Mr. Chen had predicted they would. They thought they were cornering an old, frightened woman. They thought they had me trapped. They had no idea I was the one who had set the bait, the one who had tested the strength of the bars. They had no idea that their cage was standing right on the trap door I was about to spring. The day before the conservatorship hearing was gray and heavy. The sky hung low over Carmel, a thick, bruised lid on a pot about to boil over. The air was still, pregnant with unspoken tension. This was the day. I dressed carefully, not in my usual subdued colors, but in dark trousers and a simple black sweater. I added a silk scarf, a gray and white pattern that I could pull up if needed, and a pair of large, dark sunglasses. It felt like a cliché, the uniform of a spy in an old movie, but it was a necessary armor. Anonymity was my last, most powerful weapon. I didn't take my own car. I called a rideshare, an anonymous sedan that blended in with the tourist traffic heading south on Highway 1. I directed the driver to the public library in Monterey, a city large enough and indifferent enough for me to disappear into. The drive was surreal. We passed the exit for David and Ashley's apartment complex, the signs for the prestigious golf clubs, the landmarks of a life I was systematically dismantling. Inside the library, the air was warm and smelled of old paper and dust. It was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant rhythmic clack of a keyboard. I found an open computer terminal in a carrel facing a wall, my back to the room. My heart was a frantic, muffled drum against my ribs, a wild bird beating its wings inside a cage. This was it, the point of no return. I followed the steps Maya had so patiently taught me. I navigated through the public network to a private browser, then logged into the anonymous email account. The name was simple, untraceable, Carmel Watcher 72. Inside, 3 drafts sat waiting, neat and orderly, like soldiers awaiting their command. The first was addressed to a senior investigator at the California Department of Insurance. The subject line read, Re Sterling Development, Claim Number 774B, Fire Incident 1998. The second was to an investigative reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle. I had followed her work for months on Twitter. She was tenacious, a bulldog who specialized in exposing corporate and municipal corruption. Her name was Catherine Mills. The subject line was more enticing. Tip: the cracks in Carmel's foundation. The third and final email was the most personal. It was addressed to the public office of City Councilman Michael Thorne, the son of Marcus Thorne, the night watchman who had died in Richard's fire, the man whose life had been traded for an insurance payout. The subject line was stark: Justice for Marcus Thorne. To each email, I attached a single, high-resolution file. It wasn't the most damning piece of evidence I had. That would be for the courts. It was just a taste. A single page scanned from one of Richard's private ledgers for the City Hall Annex project. The page with his spidery, arrogant handwriting in the margins, noting the purchase of sub-spec rebar from an unaccredited supplier,
and a second note next to it. Savings, 22%. City Inspector T. Riley. Bonus paid. It was just one page, but it was enough to light a fire. The body of each email was nearly identical, tweaked only slightly for the recipient. It was brief, factual, and devoid of emotion. Richard Sterling's legacy was a carefully constructed lie. His Carmel properties, including the foundations of the City Hall Annex, were built using substandard materials and fraudulent practices enabled by bribery of city officials. His son, David Sterling, has been aware of and has actively concealed these structural and financial crimes to protect his inheritance and fund his own ventures. The proof is buried in the city's own archives and in the Sterling Development financial records. The attached document is the first thread. I suggest you start pulling on it. This is not about money. This is about a crime that has gone unpunished for decades and about a man named Marcus Thorne who deserves justice. Start digging. My finger hovered over the mouse. This was the final act. I was no longer just Nora Sterling, the quiet widow in the house on the cliff. I was an anonymous source, a ghost in the machine, a whisper that would soon become a roar. I clicked send. Then I clicked send again. And a third time. 3 digital missiles launched into the world. I methodically logged out of the account, cleared the browser history, and shut down the computer. I stood up, my legs feeling surprisingly steady. I walked out of the silent, dusty library and into the cool, sea-scented air of Monterey. The fog was beginning to lift, and a pale, watery sunlight was breaking through the clouds. I had released the ghost. Now, all I had to do was wait for it to do its work. The story didn't just break, it detonated. I had expected a ripple, perhaps a localized tremor that would shake David and Ashley's gilded world. I had not anticipated a seismic event that would crack the very foundations of Carmel. The morning after I sent the emails, I walked to the end of my driveway in my robe, the damp morning air clinging to my skin, and picked up the San Francisco Chronicle. The paper felt heavy, biblical, a scroll of judgment. And there it was, splashed across the front page, a headline that seemed to shout from the newsprint, "Cracks in the Carmel Legacy, the Sterling Skeletons." My breath caught in my throat. It was real. The words I had lived with, the secrets that had festered in the dark of Richard's garden shed, were now public knowledge, laid bare for the entire world to see. I read the article standing right there on the flagstones, the world shrinking to the column of black ink. The reporter, a woman named Jessica Riley, had done her work well. She had taken the single page from Richard's ledger and used it as a key, unlocking a door I had only pointed to. She had connected it to whispers, to old rumors, to building permits and public records that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. My anonymous tip was the catalyst, but the explosion was fueled by years of pent-up truth. By noon, the street looked like a movie set. White news vans with towering satellite antennas were parked along the curb, their logos, channels 4, 5, 7, a garish parade of public interest. Reporters, men and women in sharp suits, clutched microphones and staked out positions on the sidewalk, their cameras aimed at my front door like sniper rifles. My phone began to ring, a shrill, incessant demand. I unplugged it from the wall. The silence that followed was a relief, but it was a besieged silence, the quiet of a fortress under siege. I turned on the television for the midday news, and there was Michael Thorne. He stood at a podium in front of City Hall, his face a mask of grim determination. He wasn't the fiery, performative politician I'd seen on local cable. He was the son of a man who had died in a fire. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of unanswered questions. He didn't mention my name. He didn't mention the anonymous tip. He spoke of public trust, of structural integrity, of a duty to protect the citizens of Carmel. He held up a copy of the Chronicle. "This article raises questions that go to the very heart of our city's integrity," he declared, his voice resonating with an authority that was both political and deeply personal. "Effective immediately, I am calling for an independent forensic audit of the City Hall Annex and every other public structure built by Sterling Development. We will not wait for a tragedy to expose the truth. The truth must be excavated now." The cameras flashed. A reporter shouted a question. "Councilman, are you suggesting criminal negligence?" Michael Thorne's eyes found the camera, and it felt as though he was looking directly at me, through the screen, through the walls of my house. I'm suggesting that the legacy of Richard Sterling, a legacy this city has celebrated for years, may have been built on a foundation of lies, and I intend to find out. Later that afternoon, another story broke. The State Insurance Commissioner's office had officially reopened the investigation into the 1998 construction site fire at the old commercial plaza. The case, once closed and ruled an accident, was now being re-examined as a potential arson and insurance fraud scheme. The news anchor used the name Marcus Thorne. They said he was a night watchman, a father, a victim. For the first time in over 20 years, his name was spoken with dignity, not as a footnote to an unfortunate accident, but as the central figure in a potential crime. I whispered his name in the empty living room. Marcus Thorne. It felt like a prayer, an absolution. The final piece of my carefully constructed demolition fell into place with a quiet thud, not a bang. A courier on a bicycle, weaving through the media scrum, delivered a crisp envelope from Mr. Chen's office. Inside, a single sheet of paper. It was a notice of withdrawal. David and Ashley had dropped their petition for conservatorship. Their accusations of my senility, my paranoia, my incompetence had evaporated in the harsh light of the public scandal. It was a victory, but it felt hollow, a procedural footnote in a much larger, more devastating story. The lawsuit had been the tripwire. They had run right into it, blinded by their own greed, and in doing so, had triggered the main charge. I spent the rest of the day watching the city I knew dismantle the myth I had lived in. The news cycle was a relentless churn. Experts were interviewed, structural engineers who spoke in grave tones about substandard rebar and falsified inspection reports, former city employees who suddenly had vague, troubling memories of Richard's generosity. David's name was a constant refrain. David Sterling, heir to the Sterling fortune. David Sterling, partner in the new downtown development. David Sterling, who had just filed a lawsuit questioning his own mother's mental fitness. My carefully curated package for the reporter had included more than just Richard's old crimes. I had included documents Maya helped me find in the newer files, emails between David and a project manager, discussing how to creatively address the discovery of cracked support beams in a parking garage his father had built a decade ago. It wasn't just about the past, it was about the present. David wasn't just the son of a criminal, he was his apprentice, his successor. The evening news delivered the final, inevitable blow. I was standing at the living room window, looking at the reflection of my own face superimposed over the flashing lights on the television screen. The anchor's voice was somber. We're coming to you live from downtown Carmel, where sources confirm that real estate developer David Sterling has been taken into custody for questioning in connection with the widening investigation into his late father's business practices. The camera cut to a live shot. It was David's sleek, modern office building, another monument to the Sterling name, and then I saw him. He was being led out of the glass doors by two plainclothes detectives. He wasn't in handcuffs, not yet, but their hands were firmly on his arms. His face, usually so composed, so smug with entitlement, was pale and slack. His eyes were wide, unseeing, lost in a reality he could no longer control. He looked small. He looked like the little boy who used to run to me when he scraped his knee, searching for a comfort I could no longer give. The camera zoomed in on his face, and in that moment of pure, unadulterated shock, I saw no trace of Richard's cunning, only the bewildered terror of a man whose world had just been pulled out from under him. The reporter mentioned Ashley in passing. Her car was gone from their shared driveway. Her social media profiles had been deactivated. Neighbors hadn't seen her since the morning. She had vanished, a ghost of a partner, dissolving like mist when the foundations gave way. She was never in it for David, only for what the name Sterling could provide. When the name became a liability, she disappeared. I stood there long after the news report had moved on to sports and weather. The reflection in the window showed a woman standing alone in a silent house. The chaos was outside, on the screen, down the street. Inside, there was only a vast, profound emptiness. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying release of righteous anger. I had won. I had protected my home. I had brought a kind of justice for Marcus Thorne, but the victory felt like ashes in my mouth. I had set a fire to cleanse my life, and my own son had been consumed by the flames. The price of justice was David. It was a debt I had carried for him, for Richard, for 30 years. And in the terrible, hollow quiet of my living room, I knew I had finally paid it in full. The news vans eventually packed up and drove away, chasing the next scandal. The reporters stopped calling. The name Sterling, once a banner of prestige in Carmel, became a quiet stain, a story people whispered about at dinner parties. The seasons turned, bleeding one into the other. The frantic energy of the fallout subsided, replaced by the slow, grinding mechanics of the law. A strange, quiet calm settled over my life, over my house. The silence that returned was different. It wasn't the oppressive, watchful silence of Richard's reign, or the besieged silence of the media circus. It was something new. It was simply quiet. Mr. Chen's updates arrived not by phone call, but by encrypted email, discreet and professional. The Sterling estate, or what was left of it after the city's lawsuits and the federal investigations, was being methodically liquidated. Properties were sold, accounts were closed, assets were untangled from a web of deceit that went back decades. It was a slow, painstaking process of demolition, conducted not with dynamite and bulldozers, but with gavels and legal signatures. With each email, a piece of Richard's empire crumbled to dust, and the funds trickled, slowly but surely, into a newly formed account. The Marcus Thorne Project. I saw a small article about it online one afternoon. A nonprofit had been established, funded by an anonymous endowment, to provide pro bono legal services and advocacy for victims of corporate and construction fraud. The chairman of its board was Councilman Michael Thorne. There was no mention of me, no mention of the Sterlings. It was clean. It was a new beginning, built from the rubble of the old. I had won. The conservatorship was a distant, ludicrous memory. The court had affirmed, with stern finality, my right to live in this house until the day I die. My home. The prize they had been so desperate to claim was now, unequivocally, mine. This morning, the air is sharp with the promise of autumn. The marine layer is thick over the ocean, a soft gray blanket hiding the horizon. Maya is here. She drove down late last night, letting herself in with the key I gave her. We sit on the porch, the same porch where I used to watch Richard hold court, the same porch from which I watched David drive away for the last time. We are wrapped in thick wool blankets against the morning chill, our hands cupped around warm mugs of coffee. The steam rises in little puffs of white against the gray air. We don't speak of David. There is nothing left to say. His case is ongoing, a tangle of plea bargains and pending charges. He is out on bail, living somewhere down in Los Angeles, a pariah in the world he once sought to conquer. I sent him one letter through his lawyer. It just said, "I'm sorry for all of it." I don't know if he ever read it. It doesn't matter. Some things are too broken to be mended. Instead, we watch the sun. It begins as a faint glow behind the gray, then a determined sliver of light that burns through the fog. Slowly, majestically, it rises, painting the sky and the surface of the water in impossible strokes of rose and gold. The light spills across the porch, warming my face. For the first time since I moved in here as a young bride, the silence in this house is not a weapon. It isn't the oppressive weight of things unsaid, the suffocating quiet of a life lived on someone else's terms. It's peace. It's the gentle clink of a coffee mug, the distant cry of a gull, the slow, rhythmic sigh of the waves on the shore. It's the sound of my own breathing. The house itself feels different. It's no longer a monument to Richard's tyranny, a cold museum of his success. It's no longer a prize for David's avarice, a bargaining chip in a game of emotional blackmail. The ghosts have been exorcised. The gold plating has been stripped away, revealing the simple, sturdy frame underneath. It is simply my home, a sanctuary that I had to burn to the ground, metaphorically to reclaim. The foundations are finally clean. I look over at Maya. She catches my eye and gives me a small, gentle smile. She doesn't need to ask if I'm okay. She knows. In her, I see the future, a future built not on deceit and ambition, but on quiet strength, on loyalty, on love. The legacy of this family will not be Richard's corruption or David's greed. It will be her. It will be the Marcus Thorne Project. It will be this moment of peace. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I have my home. I have my memories, the good ones I am finally free to reclaim, and I have the sunrise. After a lifetime spent in the shadow of other people's desires, I am finally living in my own light. I am free. Nora's story of reclaiming her life is complete, but for so many, the fight is just beginning. What would you have done in her place? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's talk about the silent battles that deserve a voice.